Flashpoint is going live right now because what just happened in the corridors of global power cannot wait another hour. Stop whatever you are doing and listen carefully, because the geopolitical earthquake that struck last night has sent shockwaves through every war room, every trading floor, and every intelligence bunker from Tel Aviv to Washington to Moscow. This is not commentary. This is not speculation. This is the cold clinical autopsy of an empire that just discovered its armor has a hole in it, and the man holding the shield is on the phone begging for his life. What we are witnessing in real time is the formal strategic bankruptcy of the Israeli state, exposed not by a diplomatic failure, not by a political scandal, but by a hypersonic missile that tore through the most expensive air defense system money can buy as if it were tissue paper. And in the hours that followed that impact, Benjamin Netanyahu did something that tells you everything you need to know about where this conflict is truly headed. He picked up the phone and called Donald Trump. Not with a plan, not with a strategy, not with confidence, but with a message so desperate, so raw, and so revealing that the sources who leaked it described the Israeli Prime Minister as visibly shaking. Netanyahu told Trump, if you do not authorize full American military intervention immediately, including options that were previously off the table, Israel will not be able to contain this escalation. Read that again. The leader of a nuclear-armed state, backed for decades by the most powerful military machine in human history, just confessed that he cannot win the war he started. Before we go further, Flashpoint needs to address the wall of institutional silence that has been constructed around what you are about to hear. Israeli military censorship is operating at maximum intensity. Videos are being scrubbed from servers within minutes of appearing. Accounts are being suspended, journalists inside the region are receiving direct legal threats, and the Western Atlanticist media apparatus, from the network studios in New York to the broadcast centers in London, is running a coordinated blackout on the full scope of what occurred. Ask yourself why. Ask yourself what it means when a government that claims moral superiority over its adversaries responds to a military event by making it a crime for its own citizens to look at photographs. The answer is not national security. The answer is that the financial markets have not yet been told the full story. And if they were, the capital flight from Tel Aviv would be instantaneous and catastrophic. The details of the missile strike that triggered this emergency call are being suppressed with a ferocity that is itself a confession. A modified hypersonic glide vehicle representing the cutting edge of Eurasian ballistic engineering penetrated the layered air defense envelope over Jerusalem and struck within proximity of the Israeli Prime Minister's own office. The Iron Dome, that multi-billion-dollar technological miracle sold to the world as the gold standard of missile defense, the crown jewel of Western arms export marketing, did not stop it. Radar systems that cost more than the annual GDP of several developing nations did not detect it in time. The most densely defended airspace in the Middle East was pierced by a single warhead, and the psychological impact of that penetration on the Israeli military and political establishment cannot be overstated. It is the equivalent of a thief walking through your state-of-the-art vault door as if it were open, taking nothing, and leaving a note that says, "We were just testing." Now let us conduct the honest geopolitical analysis that the corporate press refuses to perform. Netanyahu's emergency message to Trump is not the communication of a confident ally coordinating military strategy. It is the distress signal of a client state that has just realized the patron's guarantee is insufficient. For decades, the entire Israeli strategic posture rested on a single foundational assumption: that Western technological superiority, funded by American taxpayers and operationalized through systems like Iron Dome, David Sling, and Arrow 3, created an impenetrable defensive umbrella that made conventional deterrence obsolete. That assumption died last night. And when that assumption died, so did the psychological foundation of Israeli military confidence. The phrase Netanyahu reportedly used, "If we do not act now, we will lose the strategic advantage forever," is not the language of a commander planning the next offensive. It is the language of a man watching the sand drain from an hourglass he thought had unlimited reserves. Here is what Flashpoint wants you to understand about the economic architecture of this panic, because this is where most analysis fails. The missile that struck near Jerusalem did not just cause physical damage. It caused instantaneous financial depreciation of an entire product line. Corporations like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Boeing have spent decades selling the illusion of impenetrable defense to every American ally on the planet. Nations across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East took on generational debt to purchase Patriot batteries, terminal high-altitude area defense systems, and advanced radar technology. The entire sales pitch rested on demonstrated effectiveness. That demonstration has now been inverted. The world just watched, in real time, a Eurasian hypersonic vehicle defeat the most sophisticated interception technology the Western military-industrial complex could produce. The market value of American air defense exports, a multi-hundred billion dollar revenue stream that underpins defense contractor profits and, by extension, significant portions of Wall Street investment portfolios, has just taken a structural hit from which recovery requires either a convincing counter-demonstration or a complete media blackout. They are trying option 2 right now, and it is not working. Trump's response to the Netanyahu call, according to the diplomatic sources who have filtered details to independent journalists, was not the decisive leadership his political brand promises. He asked for time. He retreated. He is caught in a contradiction so fundamental, so structural, that it paralyzed him before he could even frame a response. On one side of this contradiction stands the military-industrial lobby, the neoconservative faction within his administration, and the defense contractors whose stock prices depend on perpetual conflict. They are demanding that Trump authorize Plan B, massive preemptive strikes on Iranian nuclear and military infrastructure, with full American strategic air power committed to the operation. Their argument is simple. The only way to restore the credibility of American deterrence after this humiliation is to demonstrate overwhelming retaliatory capacity. From their perspective, the deaths of Iranian workers, engineers, and civilians are an acceptable line item on the balance sheet of imperial maintenance. This is not an exaggeration. This is the documented historical logic of every American military intervention since 1953. On the other side of this contradiction stands the financial establishment, the banks, the logistics corporations, the energy trading houses, the sovereign wealth funds, that understands with crystalline clarity what a full American military assault on Iran would actually mean for the global economy. They know that Russia is not bluffing. Vladimir Putin has drawn a red line, and unlike the red lines drawn by American administrations over the past 20 years, this one comes with operational military capacity to enforce it. A massive American strike on Iran activates the mutual defense architecture that Moscow and Tehran have consolidated. The strategic choke points through which the world's energy supply flows, the Strait of Hormuz, the Bab el-Mandeb, the pipelines feeding into the eastern Mediterranean, become theaters of asymmetric warfare overnight. Drone swarms, naval mines, anti-ship missiles of Russian design operating in the hands of Iranian forces close those arteries. European nations dependent on Gulf energy face rationing. Asian manufacturing chains dependent on petrochemical feedstocks grind toward halt. American consumers, already strained by existing inflation, face an energy price shock of a magnitude that would dwarf every previous oil crisis in modern history. This is not a nightmare scenario invented by anti-war activists. This is the cold actuarial assessment being run right now by the risk desks of major financial institutions, and it is the reason Wall Street's commercial banking fraction is screaming at the White House to stand down. This tension between the war profit faction and the capital preservation faction within American ruling class is the real story behind Trump's paralysis. And Netanyahu, cornered and increasingly desperate, is exploiting that paralysis through a form of nuclear blackmail that should terrify every person on this planet, regardless of their political orientation. The reports from intelligence sources indicate that during that same emergency call, Netanyahu raised the possibility of unilateral action if Trump does not provide an affirmative response within an accelerated timeline. Unilateral action, in the diplomatic vocabulary of a nuclear-armed state facing existential military pressure, is a reference to the Samson option, Israel's undeclared nuclear doctrine, the strategic posture that says if the state faces destruction, it will use atomic weapons to ensure that its adversaries do not survive to celebrate. Netanyahu is not merely asking for American help. He is threatening to force American involvement by initiating a nuclear exchange that no administration in Washington could politically survive refusing to join. This is the leverage of a vassal that has gone rabid, threatening to burn down the entire neighborhood unless the master comes running with a fire hose. The media apparatus that is supposed to inform the public about precisely this kind of civilizational threat is instead functioning as its public relations department. Watch how CNN frames Iranian ballistic responses to Israeli strikes on civilian airports and political assassinations, terrorism, unprovoked aggression, threat to regional stability. Watch how those same networks frame Israeli operations that killed hundreds of Iranian civilians and assassinated a head of state on sovereign territory. Surgical strikes, proportionate self-defense, necessary security measures. The architecture of this double standard is not accidental, and it is not the product of individual editorial bias. It is the systematic operationalization of a colonial hierarchy of human value encoded into the language of international affairs reporting that assigns full moral personhood to Western casualties and statistical abstraction to Eurasian ones. When the anchor puts on his somber face for 12 Israeli deaths and returns 2 segments later to discuss Iranian fatalities in the passive voice without named victims, without family photographs, without street-level reporting, that is not journalism. That is psychological conditioning designed to manufacture consent for the next phase of military escalation. Flashpoint will not participate in that conditioning. What the Western media machine is also refusing to contextualize is the sequence of provocation that produced this military exchange. The Iranian ballistic response did not emerge from a vacuum. It is the direct, material, and under any honest reading of international law, proportionate response to a series of Israeli actions that included the targeted assassination of Iranian political leadership, the deliberate bombing of civilian airport infrastructure designed to terrorize a civilian population, and the systematic degradation of Iranian sovereignty over a sustained period of military operations financed entirely by American taxpayers. When you strip away the manufactured framing and look at the sequence of events in the order they actually occurred, the picture that emerges is not of an unprovoked aggressor threatening a peaceful democracy. It is of a colonized territory conducting defensive operations against a regional military occupation that has been sustained by external imperial power for 3/4 of a century. Now consider what is happening simultaneously in the financial and diplomatic architecture of the multipolar world, because this is where the truly strategic story is unfolding. China and Russia are not sending armies to the Levant. They do not need to. Their strategy is more elegant, more economically devastating to Western interests, and more historically significant than any battlefield maneuver. Russia provides the technological shield, advanced air defense systems, hypersonic design architecture, and the credible nuclear umbrella that makes American strategic air power hesitate before committing to operations over Iranian airspace. China provides the economic oxygen, guaranteed purchase agreements for Iranian hydrocarbons, settled through the cross-border interbank payment system rather than SWIFT, denominating transactions in yuan and gold rather than dollars. Every barrel of Iranian oil that clears through Beijing's financial infrastructure rather than Washington's is a brick removed from the petrodollar foundation. The dollar's status as global reserve currency is not a law of nature. It is a political arrangement enforced by military credibility. When that military credibility is publicly demonstrated to be insufficient, when a hypersonic missile hits the Prime Minister's office of America's most important Middle Eastern ally, the political arrangement begins to unravel. For nations across Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, and South Asia, the strategic lesson being processed right now in foreign ministries and central banks is straightforward and irreversible. Dependency on the dollar system is a trap, and the lock on that trap has just been shown to be breakable. Brazil, South Africa, India, Indonesia, the great middle powers of the emerging multipolar order, are watching a single hypersonic glide vehicle do more to accelerate de-dollarization than a decade of BRICS summits. When the military force that is supposed to underwrite the value of your dollar-denominated reserves cannot protect the office of its own primary regional ally, the rational response is to diversify away from that reserve with urgency. The flight toward gold, toward bilateral currency arrangements, toward physical commodity-backed trade, that flight was already underway. What happened last night turned it into a sprint. Here is the final strategic calculus that Flashpoint needs you to hold in your mind as the next 24 to 48 hours unfold, because this is the decision point that will define the economic and geopolitical architecture of the coming decades. Trump faces a binary choice with no good options and catastrophic consequences on both branches. If he approves Plan B and authorizes full American military engagement against Iranian nuclear and military infrastructure, he triggers the defensive response architecture of the Russia-Iran mutual security relationship, closes the strategic choke points, detonates the global energy market, produces hyperinflationary shock in every petroleum-dependent economy on Earth, and accelerates the dollar's displacement from its reserve currency role at a velocity that the Federal Reserve has no monetary tool to address. If he refuses Netanyahu's demand, he certifies in public before every government and every financial institution on the planet that American military guarantees to client states are contingent, unreliable, and ultimately insufficient against peer-level adversaries. Netanyahu, stripped of American cover, faces domestic political destruction. His population now knows that he led them into a war without an exit strategy, and the legal proceedings that were already threatening his political career will accelerate. But the global message will also be unambiguous. The imperial umbrella has holes. The censorship operation currently being run by Israeli military authorities and amplified by cooperative Western media platforms is not about operational security. If it were about operational security, they would not be scrubbing civilian social media posts that show publicly visible damage to publicly visible structures. This is about market psychology. It is about preventing the capital markets from pricing in the full information of what occurred, because the moment institutional investors fully process that the Iron Dome failed against a hypersonic vehicle, the defense contract valuations, the Israeli sovereign debt ratings, and the broader confidence premium embedded in dollar-denominated assets all require significant downward revision. They are not protecting national security. They are protecting stock prices. They are managing the narrative to buy time for the financial sector to reposition before the retail investor public understands what has actually happened. And they are counting on the media apparatus, CNN, BBC, Fox News, the full spectrum of corporate broadcast infrastructure to hold the informational perimeter long enough for that repositioning to complete. Flashpoint exists precisely to break that perimeter. The human cost of this conflict, and Flashpoint will state this without qualification, without strategic framing, without the language of geopolitical chess, is a moral catastrophe that implicates every government, every arms manufacturer, every financial institution, and every media organization that has participated in its construction. The working class families in Iran who have lost children, parents, homes, and futures to Western-financed military operations are not abstractions. They are not collateral damage entries on a strategic spreadsheet. They are human beings whose lives carry exactly the same moral weight as the Israeli families mourning their own dead. Both sets of deaths are the direct product of a militarist system that requires perpetual conflict to sustain the profit margins of corporations that contribute to political campaigns on both sides of the Atlantic. The grieving mother in Tehran and the grieving mother in Tel Aviv are victims of the same machine, and the machine's operators are currently on the phone with each other, deciding how many more of those mothers they are willing to create before they consider stopping. For the working class internationally, for the dock worker in Rotterdam who loads the weapons containers, for the factory worker in Ohio whose tax dollars finance the defense contracts, for the agricultural laborer in Egypt who will pay the food price consequences of a Gulf energy disruption, For the software engineer in Bangalore whose supply chain depends on stable commodity markets, this is not a distant conflict. The hyperinflation that follows an energy market disruption does not ask your political opinions before it eliminates your purchasing power. The economic depression that follows a collapse of global trade finance does not exempt you because you oppose the war. The radiation that follows a nuclear exchange does not respect national borders or ideological preferences. The consequences of what is being decided right now in private phone calls between men who have never worked a day in physical labor in their lives will land on the bodies and the bank accounts of people who had no voice in the decision. That is the fundamental obscenity of imperialism in its terminal phase. The people who make the catastrophic choices bear none of the catastrophic costs. Flashpoint calls for something simple and immediate: full informational solidarity. Share what you are hearing. Break the media blackout through every channel available to you. Demand from your elected representatives a public accounting of what commitments have been made, what authorizations have been sought, and what red lines have been communicated to and from Washington in the last 72 hours. Demand transparency about arms shipments, about intelligence sharing agreements, about the financial mechanisms through which your tax revenues are being converted into ordnance, dropped on civilian infrastructure in sovereign nations. The censorship operation only works if you do not talk. The media blackout only holds if you do not share. The political cover only survives if the working class remains atomized, confused, and consuming manufactured narratives rather than documented facts. The invulnerability myth has been shattered over Jerusalem. The technological supremacy that the Western military-industrial complex has sold to its own populations and its client states for 3 generations has been publicly, visibly, and irreversibly falsified by a single warhead manufactured at a fraction of the cost of the system it defeated. The emperor has no clothes, and the desperate phone call from a terrified prime minister to an uncertain president is the sound of that nakedness being recognized for the first time at the highest levels of imperial power. What happens next is not predetermined. History is not a script. The decisions made in the next 24 hours by Trump, by Netanyahu, by Putin, by the financial institutions repositioning their exposure, and by the populations of the world who are only now beginning to understand what their governments have done in their name, all of those decisions are still in motion. Flashpoint will continue to report what the corporate media will not. Stay with us.